So I was scanning some newspapers this morning from June of 1906. I thought it would be a fun exercise to look at what was happening in North Carolina in 1906 since we're using a primary source for this assignment. I just thought it would be a neat connection. Maybe I could see any relevance to this, and I did. I ran across an interesting and fitting article related to the Progressive Era and an investigation that was launched into the meatpacking industry, greatly in part to the work of the Muckrakers. The article I almost serendipitously stumbled across was in the Semi Weekly Messenger. It was a Wilmington newspaper, and it shows the effective power of the muckraker and changing attitudes about the role of government and its relationship with private business. The article, Denial of Report, Conditions of Meatpacking Houses Not So Vile, detailed a meatpacking industry representative's refutation of a recent report to Congress on the conditions of the meatpacking industry. This governmental inquiry, which was started by Teddy Roosevelt and followed up by a congressional committee investigation, was sparked by a series of expose articles about the abuses of the beef trust. In 1905, Charles Russell published The Greatest Trust in the World in Everybody's Magazine. It was an expose on the beef trust's monopoly on the refrigerated car and how that allowed them to develop this stranglehold nearly on all perishable foods and the transportation of those in the United States. The article was later expanded into a book that year and really provided a springboard for Upton Sinclair's famous work, The Jungle, which is one of the most celebrated progressive works of the era. The Jungle, although fictional, sought to expose problems in the meatpacking industry and raise awareness in society. And Russell and Sinclair's work did just that. They sparked a firestorm of interest into the meatpacking process and the meatpacking industry, where even the United States president threw in his hat and became interested, particularly in consumer protections and workplace conditions in the meatpacking industry. Roosevelt quickly initiated a governmental inquiry into the meatpacking industry that led to a congressional investigation. And if the investigation culminated in the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, which required meat processing plants and companies to allow unfettered access for government inspectors into processing facilities to ensure a minimum sanitary requirements in both the slaughtering and processing of those meats. Last week's assignment addressed Thomas Nast, the political cartoonist who in many ways signaled the coming of a new wave of advocate journalists known as the Muckrakers. This week's assignment builds on that theme by looking deeper into the Muckrakers as a journalistic force as America entered the progressive era. As America entered the 20th century, the Industrial Revolution, mass immigration, and urbanization had changed how and where people lived dramatically. And this was one of an immense change that happened very quickly since the end of the Civil War. And it's hard to think of a human change that was as dramatic to the way people lived and what they did than occurred at this period. Maybe we're actually living in one with the introduction of the internet and how that's changed fundamentally how we work, how we communicate, and how we interact, right? The immense changes at the beginning of the 20th century did not come without growing pains. However, American businesses grew tremendously because of their ability to mechanize new business structures that allowed them to drive down production costs and grab larger shares of the market, often resulted in monopolization of those marketplaces All this resulted in the massive creation of wealth on a scale that the world had never seen before, and one that we've become very familiar with today. You couple this with an absence of government regulation and their ability to keep labor costs extremely low because of the continued influx of labor, you find that American businesses grew exponentially, both in wealth and reach and influence and power. And importance in American society. Americans were very happy with this growth, but not always happy with the cost that ensued socially. And progressivism was a social reaction to these changes and reflected a sentiment that people were believed that they could dictate the society they lived in by exposing abuse in that society and initiating reform. As corporations created immense wealth, they also accumulated tremendous economic, political, and social power. And many Americans believed that government had to grow accordingly to provide some oversight and protection for the consumer and the worker in lieu of these empowered corporations. And the Meat Inspection Act is just one example of this brewing sentiment in America. One element about studying the past I've really tried to promote in this course is the ability to find relevance and value in that study to today's society. And I think we see that here. We're continuing to ask and reevaluate questions, the very questions that Americans were asking at the beginning of the 20th century. Questions about the relationship between government and business, consumer protections, regulation of private industry, and ethical obligations of businesses to society are still very alive in our social discourse. Just recently, Facebook founder and CEO Mark Zuckerberg appeared before a senatorial committee to discuss consumer privacy rights. And like Thomas Wilson, who stood before the Senate in 1906 answering questions about the meatpacking industry, Zuckerberg endured several days of questions in the April of 2018. Interestingly, the call for such an inquiry emerged from an expose work done by the New York Times titled How Trump Consultants Exploited the Facebook Data of Millions. And this was an expose work that was meant to tap into issues about social media, the influence of outsiders in American elections. And while the subject matter between the meatpacking industry and that of what's going on Facebook and American elections might not be directly connected, they do correlate. And what they correlate and the similarities that are seen can be seen in two areas. One, in the process, is that we see the value or the influence that journalists can have on American society into raising awareness about an issue, about promoting social change. And we also see another element too, where the government feels some sort of not obligation, but has some sort of role in interacting with these businesses. And that leads us to the next component, and that is, how do businesses and their relationship to consumer, these ethical relationships, do they exist? Do they have obligations to the consumer? And should the government be an advocate for the consumer? Should it be an advocate for the business? Can it do both at the same time, or should it not be involved? And very similar questions were being asked in 1906. So the connections are there, folks, and I hope you found this bonus lesson helpful in continuing to tease out these ideas.